Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Uncover Your Authentic Personal Brand, with UCLA alumna and career coach, Alicia Anagnostou. My name is Joseph Blancas, and I serve as an assistant director for alumni career engagement at UCLA Alumni Affairs. In today's program, we will explore what elements make up an authentic personal brand and the role of your individual life stories and what they play in building that brand. I want to take this opportunity to thank our Alumni Association sustaining donors. It's with your help that we are able to strengthen the Bruin community with career programs like this. For some general webinar housekeeping, we'll have time at the end of our program for a Q&A with Alicia, so please use the Q&A function below to submit your questions. We will be recording the event and we'll send it out at a later date. Now, to start our program, I'm excited to introduce Alicia Anagnostou. Alicia is a sociologist, creative nonfiction writer, Vice President of Client Loyalty and Retention for a Fortune 500 company, and is the founder of First Edition Coaching. With more than 20 years of experience in corporate leadership, she has coached and mentored both emerging and established leaders in a wide array of industries. Alicia believes in the importance of giving voice to one's core values through thoughtful word choice, purposeful messaging, and the sharing of powerful life stories. With that, I'll turn it over to Alicia to start our program.
First, let me go ahead and start by sharing my screen.
We can see it.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. Thank you for being here and for spending your time this afternoon discussing this very important topic, authentic personal branding. For some, this may be an initial exploration, but for others, it may be a reimagining of personal branding, or perhaps you're engaged in a brand rebuild. I am certainly an expert in that area, as I'm sure we may have others on the call who fall into this category as well. Whomever imagined that there was more learning in our failures than there is in our successes was certainly right. In the present day, in our work environment, building an authentic personal brand is arguably more important than it ever was before. The advantages have quickly surpassed those of the brand historically postured towards consumerism and primarily focused on wealth creation. So we're going to explore branding, what it means to be authentic in our branding, and then perhaps most importantly, I'm going to invite you all to participate in a visualization exercise to tease out and identify the one or two values that may resonate most deeply with you. Keeping in mind that branding is a huge topic. So there is much information and research available on branding and so many facets to consider. Content, connections, online presence, etc. And so today we will be focused on a simple yet arguably the most important piece, the identification of your value set behind your branding. So in an effort to co-create this experience before we get started, I invite you all to stay active in the chat box. Let's go ahead and try that now. So if you would, please share with the group where you're located and whether you're here as a first-time developer of your personal brand, or do you find yourself reimagining your personal brand? Meaning, are you headed perhaps into an encore career? So share with us, if you would, just really in the chat, perhaps where you're located, and then likewise, what brings you here? Are you a first-time brand builder, or are you reimagining your personal brand? Ohio and Los Angeles, welcome to those from Canada, Orange County, Marin, a lot of California folks, North Carolina, Santa Monica, more California, Los Gatos, a lot of Bay Area folks. Fantastic. I myself am also in the Bay Area. I'm currently sitting in San Mateo, New York City. Perfect, thanks so much. Awesome, and a lot of people who are here reimagining or exploring branding, having conversation around branding. So fantastic, thanks so much for saying hello and letting us know where you're at. In our experiences, it's our interests and what we value about those experiences and interests that ultimately work to connect each of us to the other. The fact that we are all graduates or in some way affiliated with UCLA, it's certainly part of this common experience. And if we choose, it can be part of our personal branding as well. So a word about me as we get started in this conversation. Again, my name is Alicia Anagnostou. I am originally from the Bay Area. I grew up in the East Bay, and I've really lived everywhere within Northern California, from Santa Clara, Castro Valley, San Francisco, and now I split time between the Peninsula and San Mateo and the North Bay and Napa. I was a sociology major at UCLA. I graduated in 1996, and my time at UCLA was highlighted by the O.J. Simpson trial, Bill Clinton speaking at the 75th convocation in Pauley Pavilion, and an NCAA championship in men's basketball. Perhaps we might get one again this year. And my favorite spot on campus was a sculpture garden, but I spent a majority of my time in Kirchhoff Hall, which is behind me, between both the coffee shop and the Daily Bruin, where I worked for 3 years. I am an active member of the UCLA Alumni Association, and I sit on the board of the Bay Area Bruins, where I serve the Peninsula community. For those of you who are in Northern California and or close to the Peninsula, please check out the Bay Area Bruin website. We do have a hike coming up in April, which yours truly will be leading, so join us. I am also a VP of Client Retention at ADP, a Fortune 500 company. In 2021, I did start my own coaching business, First Edition Coaching, a values-based coaching organization. And I'm also a volunteer at the Trauma Research Foundation, as I too am a 25-year survivor of sexual assault and now actively working to create trauma-informed workplaces and communities. I have also been known to podcast, and most recently joined Michael Stein on an episode of his podcast, Long Shot Leaders. So why do I host this webinar? A few reasons. First, I certainly enjoyed my time at UCLA. I've reached a point in my professional career where giving back is not only feasible for me, but it's a priority. I am a professional career coach, and I do spend several hours a week working with emerging leaders, many of whom are actually graduates of UCLA, and I really help them define their authentic personal brand and advance their careers. Please take a moment and scan my QR code if you would like to stay connected. And if you don't know that yet, I will repost my QR code at the end of the session, should you decide to connect. So how many of you actually searched for me via LinkedIn even prior to today's workshop? Now, I ask this question because authenticity and honesty play a major role in the business world, with 86% of consumers saying that they will research a brand on social media even before deciding whether or not to do business. And that's from HubSpot. That number actually jumps to 93% if I'm considering you for a position. So let's get in the right mindset, right? And start by defining what it means to be authentic, or what does authentic mean? Authentic has been given so many different definitions, or people, the way that they're using it or positioning it. So authentic being the quality of being genuine or not corrupted from the original. It's really a mixture of three main values. And I talk a lot about values in the work that I do. And I recognize that talking about values likewise at times means defining them and engaging in a conversation where we are really explaining what those values mean to us and to somebody else. So three main values being transparency, vulnerability, and integrity. So transparent is an adjective, having thoughts, feelings, or motives that are easily perceived. Transparent in my thoughts, feelings, and motives. Vulnerable, that I am susceptible in that moment to physical or emotional attack, what I refer to as walking along the curb. When I am working with someone, perhaps an emerging leader, and I'm providing coaching, and perhaps they've read one of Brene Brown's fantastic books on vulnerability and the power of vulnerability in the workplace. And we all know why it's important, but what does it look like? What does vulnerability look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And sometimes I will draw back on this dream that I have frequently, and I know that many people do. And it's pretty common, that this dream of stepping off or slipping off, and you have this feeling of falling, which will wake you, right? Oftentimes we catch ourselves and it startles us and we're woken up. For me, that dream, I'm always walking on a curb, right? And I step off a curb. So it's about a 6-inch drop. I've never measured a curb, but I may go outside after this call and do that. But it's about a 6 or 8-inch curb, and you're walking on the curb and you slip, right? And the thought being, when we are showing vulnerability, we're walking on that curb and perhaps we've slipped. But two things can happen. Either someone else that we are working with, right, or who is listening, will say, hey, I've got you. And they put out their hands, I've got you, or I will catch you, right? It's okay to let go, I will catch you. Or equally as fantastic, we catch ourselves, right? Just as we do in that dream where we are startled and we wake up, we catch ourselves. So vulnerability, in my mind, and the way I reference it, is walking on the curb. And then finally, integrity. And integrity very plainly means to be honest. There are so many uses and definitions and ways that people are defining authenticity right now. These lines behind, this red line behind, I love this. When you go to search a word and you're looking for the definition or the common usage of a word, this red line represents how frequently the word authentic is being used today. And you can certainly see that from 1980 to the present day, authentic has absolutely come back into our conversation. And so now let's put ourselves in the right mindset to consider the following individuals who arguably embody some of the most prominent authentic personal brands. As we move through these images, I invite you to share a single word or two in that chat box that ultimately come to mind, a value, an emotion, or a personality trait. And so here we go. Strong, absolutely. Charismatic, for sure. Diligent, thoughtful. Yes. Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was an American professional boxer. He was an activist and an entertainer. He was also a philanthropist. In 1966, Ali refused to be drafted into the military, citing his religious beliefs and ethical opposition to the Vietnam War. Every time I talk about him, I get chills. I have to say that because it happened again. He was found guilty of draft evasion. So he faced 5 years in prison and was stripped of his boxing titles during that time. His actions as a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War made him an icon for the larger counterculture generation. He was a high-profile figure for racial pride during the civil rights movement, and he was a supporter of racial integration. A word or a personality trait, same exercise that comes to mind, altruism, for sure, for sure. Yes. Kindness, yes. Selfless. I said the same thing, Corey. Mother Teresa, a Roman Catholic nun who lived much of her life serving the poorest of the poor in India. And she received numerous honors, including the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979. She was canonized, so that's right, she was a saint on September 4th of 2016. And she was also a controversial figure during her life and after her death. She was admired most for her charitable work. And that idea of controversy, or perhaps something that goes against really the common thought, it comes up time and time again as someone is building or practicing an authentic personal brand. Muhammad Ali certainly had it. Mother Teresa at times also experienced this controversy around her life and death, and some of the other figures we'll look at did the same. Same exercise. Imaginative is a big one. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. Yeah. Stephen Hawking is an English theoretical physicist. He also studied the cosmos, and he spent much of his life doing that. He was also an author. Thanks to his groundbreaking work with black holes and relativity, he went on to hold distinguished academic posts, be appointed commander of the Order of the British Empire, and he earned the Presidential Medal of Freedom, all while his body deteriorated from ALS. ALS was supposed to have killed Stephen Hawking in the mid-1960s. An interesting fact about Stephen Hawking, he actually considered his robotic voice, its distinctly non-British accent, as part of his identity. He also had a wicked sense of humor, at times showing up on modern day sitcoms, including, I think, The Simpsons, and a few others. And finally, the last one, again, just to put us in the right mindset, same exercise, a word or personality trait that you would use or that comes to mind. Yeah, grit for sure. I love that. Fearless for sure. This is Greta Thunberg. She's a Swedish environmental activist who is internationally known for challenging world leaders to take immediate action for climate change mitigation. Her sudden rise to world fame has made her both a leader and a target for critics, especially due to her age. Her influence on the world stage has been described as the Greta effect. So these are all examples of the best in brand authenticity, really intended to get us thinking about personal values. I hope that that worked. And I hope that we're moving into a value-based mindset. So let's take a moment to define personal brand or personal branding more formally. Now that we've defined authentic and the values perhaps associated with showing authenticity, let's talk about personal brand for a moment and the evolution of branding. A personal brand is a widely recognized and largely uniform perception or impression of an individual based on their experience, their expertise, their actions, and their achievements within a community, industry, or a marketplace at large. But what makes such a brand resonate? How the public persona, the brand, is directly correlated to how closely it reflects the personal values, philosophies, traits, and mission of the individual. which I believe we can say for our examples here, there was a high resonance between their personal brand and their personal values, right? 89% of consumers have said that they relate to brands that share the same values that they do, which is why this exercise of moving through value identification when we are talking about building an authentic personal brand is so important. So let's talk about then what's ahead. We're going to take a few minutes to talk about authentic again, right, as we've done. We're going to talk about the most important relationship, which is the relationship that we have with ourselves. A lot of the literature calls out the importance of being able to self-reflect. We will touch on, we will also investigate this idea, and we are going to review the elements of a strong personal brand. And then finally, we're going to work through a visualization exercise that will help us to identify the one or two values that may be the most resonant with you. So let's take a moment to talk about the self. How did we land here? In our journey to identify and formulate our authentic personal brand, we need to examine the relationship that we have with ourselves. David McNally and Carl Speak, perhaps the first authorities on personal branding, in 2002 proposed that the most intimate relationship you have is with yourself. And a strong personal brand is a powerful way for the world to see and value that authentic you. And with the importance of self and brand, with that importance, the self began to emerge in branding. For those who are interested, McNally and Speak co-authored a book called Be Your Own Brand. In 2010 then, a cultural sociologist, Lionel Lee and Ann Brooks, published additional work that argued that enterprise culture, this is now a few years ago, enterprise culture was shifting toward a reconstruction of work-based identities, and that ability to reflect and reflexivity in general is going to be an essential skill set, right? And that happened several years ago. We are already in that place. So how many of you have interviewed in the last year and were asked a question during that interview process, which was intended to illustrate your ability to reflect, to consider alternatives? Those questions may have sounded like, in hindsight, what might you have done differently in that situation? Or what did you learn? Qualities such as self-reliance, personal responsibility, and a willingness to take risks, step off the curb, right? Walk along that curb and allow yourself to be out there. So this willingness to take risks in the pursuit of goals would remain at the forefront. However, they reimagine the worker as no longer seeing work as a constraint upon the freedoms of the individual, but rather as an essential element to the path of self-realization. This concept of reflexivity has gained more and more momentum in the last 10 years as the responsibility of personal advancement and satisfaction has shifted from the employer and the workplace to the individual. The idea being that those who are able to pause and self-reflect will be more capable of identifying their strengths and thus be closer to understanding the value they add in any space, both personal and the workplace. Thus, our ultimate goal, to use reflection and self-knowledge to better influence how we are perceived. Enter authentic personal branding. Prior to this, any generic personal brand started from the outside of the individual and outside of the self. It placed value on marketing, money, driving sales, self-promotion, external interests. The positioning to sell yourself to others approach required constant revision and the strategic moves to stay ahead in the game in order to be relevant. It was exhausting. In this scenario, your brand became a commodity. How many people know people who operate in this space? How many people have they themselves operated? I've operated in this space, and I failed. I absolutely failed. And it also felt terrible. We all know people in this space. Perhaps they're in the public eye. Politicians are notorious for being in this space. Athletes, leaders of companies have been in this space. Most concerning, however, is when a personal brand is unmanaged or unattended to. And how many of us know people in that space? It is counterintuitive from much of what we are taught during our life via advertising and marketing, that in the workplace and often in school at times, it can lead to controversy or conflict for us personally. However, consider a personal brand which starts with the consideration of the self first, which we're going to do, right? Consider Muhammad Ali, consider the Greta Thunbergs. An authentic personal brand puts values, life philosophies, dreams, mission, identity, self-knowledge, self-responsibility, and personal positive attributes at the front, and it starts there. It creates an emotional connection, and because it is related to one's personal knowledge of self, it naturally lends to credibility. An authentic personal brand invites others in through imagery, connection, and emotion. It sparks an interest, and it gives others a reason to consider how you might add value in their life. An authentic brand does the work for you. And while it may move or pivot in your lifetime, it does not need constant revision and strategy to help it be successful. There are many benefits to building an authentic personal brand. In addition to personal satisfaction and joy, it brings rewarding partnerships, greater mind share through the creation of memorable experiences, and greater credibility. It also brings higher perceived value. Our friend Albert said, try not to become a man or woman of success, but rather a man or woman of value. Adam Grant wrote a book a few years back, Originals, and in it he highlighted a study done by two sociologists who studied non-Jews who risked their life to save Jews during the Holocaust, whom he refers to in the study as rescuers. He compared that group in the research with a group of neighbors who lived in the same town, but who did nothing. And he referred to them as non-rescuers. The study was super interesting. For those of you who haven't read the book, I know many people have, but the study was super interesting in that it revealed the ultimate differentiator between the rescuers and the non-rescuers. It was how their parents disciplined their behavior, both good and bad behavior. When the rescuers were asked to recall their childhoods and the discipline they received, rescuers discovered that the word they used most often was explained the value. The focus their parents had was on the why behind their disciplinary or praise words and actions, the moral lesson or the value to be learned rather than on the discipline itself, for example. This practice highlighted the values their parents wanted to share with their children while also encouraging critical thinking and reasoning. The gentleman who wrote the study, Oleander, concluded that by examining or explaining moral principles, the parents of the rescuer group had instilled in their children the importance of complying voluntarily with rules that align with values that they have, and to question the rules that do not. The rescuers were almost 3 times more likely to reference moral values that applied to all people, emphasizing that their parents taught them to respect others. It's actually written about more broadly in a book written in 1992 called The Altruistic Personality by Samuel and Pearl Oliner. So if the most important relationship that we have is with the self, and the most valuable personal brands are authentic, how do we begin to build one? An authentic personal brand, that is. So we're going to go ahead in a moment and engage in a visualization exercise and complete this exercise. We're going to do this in a solo environment. So I would ask that everyone go through the visualization exercise solo, but this particular visualization exercise can also be done in a workshop style. For those of you who are imagining or reimagining how it is that you can help teams in the workplace or perhaps emerging leaders, in the workplace with the Great Resignation, and the other side of that being that many of us have hired record numbers of new people into our organizations. It's also a great exercise to help people learn about each other, as well as, uncover values about themselves. So we certainly host it both ways, but today we're going to be doing it individually. So let's consider the following. Step one in the process is identifying the areas where your competencies matter. And this has to do with building a brand, right? So identify the areas where your competencies matter. And then we would go into examining the standards and values. And then finally, really applying an individual style. Perhaps the person who defined an individual style, as well as her own very authentic personal brand, the best immediately that comes to mind, may have been Princess Diana. But there are many, right? Muhammad Ali is certainly another. So we are certainly going to go through the visualization exercise. And I would say that before even doing that, clarifying your values, it's not a choice or a decision-making process. Rather, it's a discovery to uncover what is intrinsic to you and your life. So the approach is not to choose those values that you would like to have or that you think you should have. Some consider these socially desirable values, but rather it's a deeper look at what is true right now and perhaps what has always been true in your life. Ask yourself, what is important to me and what do I stand for? My visualization exercise, I'll share this story just briefly by way of example. The visualization exercise that we're going to do is peak performance. It refers to a peak performance exercise. And for those of you in California, certainly in Northern California, this rock, I'm sure, is recognizable. This is Half Dome. Half Dome sits in the Yosemite Valley in California. And as I sit here, I'm trying to recall how high Half Dome is. I can't remember. Is it 11,000 feet? That might be too high. Needless to say, this is the base. This is the base of the final push or the final ascent to the top of Half Dome. And that's me sitting at the base of the rock, debating whether or not I am going up, debating whether or not I think that is a good idea. So speaking of a peak performance moment, right? When I do this visualization exercise, which we will go through, this is the place I go. This is the moment that I have. And I can tell you in that moment, for me, connection is my number one value. I am constantly looking to connect and create spaces that allow for connection in my life. And I was not only terrified to climb up this rock, which I did do, but I was even more terrified to come down. And at one point during the descent, a man must have seen it on my face. He must have seen and connected with me, right? Connection, being heard, being seen, and being valued. And the man says to me, he was right alongside me, and he says, if you need help, this is the moment to ask for it, right? Now is the moment to ask for it. And I remember I said to him, I think I need help. And he says, and this is as I'm descending the rock, right? I'm coming down from up at the top. And he says, start by turning around. And because I, being a novice, half dome climber, was facing out away from the rock as I was descending. And he says, start by turning around. And I turned around and he said, face the rock and now come down. And when I did that, it changed everything, right? My sense of safety, psychological safety, physical safety. I was no longer, the step off of, or the slip off of that curb would have been tragic, right? And so I will never forget the moment, and the fact that I so valued connection, and I so valued him seeing me in that moment and saying the words, right? If you need help, now is the time to ask. And then sharing those words with me. And it changed everything. So let's do this. If you are comfortable doing so, join me for a moment and close your eyes. Allow a scene of your life to reveal itself in your mind. It's a time when you were at your peak performance. Let it develop so that you see it clearly, and just simply be an observer there. You can feel your feet on the ground. You can feel the ground beneath you. Notice where you are. Notice who is there with you and how time is passing. Notice the time of year and perhaps even the temperature outside. Turning your attention to what's happening around you. What's your role? Who is speaking? How do you respond or contribute? What impact do you have on others? Notice the feelings that are present with you. Is your energy high or low? What are you thinking? Why is it important? Let's stay with that scene just a moment longer. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Now calling again, right? Just using my own scene. And again, this is a little bit of a different environment as everyone is doing the visualization themselves. But in a workshop, one of the most valuable pieces is when you share that peak performance experience, and it's only one way to do it, but peak performance is pretty common. When you share that peak performance scene with someone else in a workshop format, oftentimes they will reflect back to you the values that they hear are resonant, right? And sometimes those values may not even be what you are hearing or thinking yourself, but it creates pause for you to stop and think, right? As you are sort of peeling away which of these values actually touches most closely on what it is that is always with me, that does not change, right? This is a really short list of values. There are hundreds of values. Every time I have a complete or comprehensive set, or I think it is, I work with an emerging leader, a recent graduate who fills in, his or her own number of values. So these would be values that perhaps you heard even in your own story. Connection, altruism, we talked about earlier. Gratitude, humor was certainly one that came up, or I know that we had mentioned earlier. And so one of the things that I do, even in my own work, and if you were to follow me on social media, you'll see I'm often using small note cards to define some of these values and to simply define the words, as it's important as we create an environment where we are leading from a value-based leadership or value-based branding, that our communication and our word choices share common definitions that are understood by everyone. So if I was, and again, this is what the workshop, for those of you who might be interested in either leading your own workshop with new team members within your teams, or even as leaders, this is what a workshop setup might look like. A sample or draft branding statement. Where do I go from here, Alicia? Now I have identified one or two values that resonate, or I believe resonate with me. How do I then begin to build a branding statement? A branding statement might look something like this. I value blank. By being blank, I am, and then I use it to do the following. I value connection, as I was talking about, I recognized on that big rock. Connection allows me to clearly identify the needs of others, and it allows me to see someone else, to see others, both the associates that I work with professionally and the clients that I work with through my business. I use this connection to build trust, which allows me to provide emerging leaders and clients a safe space to imagine and reimagine the best versions of themselves. Very important. I'm keeping an eye on time, and so I do want to move through this next slide. So next steps, you want to always look to seek feedback on your branding statement or a draft of it. Going through visualization exercises, whether they be, again, individual or in groups, very powerful. Journaling, also very powerful, right? As you start to kind of peel back and really place your finger on the one or two values that you think are most resonant. You want to finalize and share your branding statement and then socialize it. If you are sharing your branding statement, or you're, taking these opportunities to perhaps walk along the curb, and if someone is recognizing that you're doing that and is catching you, holding you, right, saying, I've got you, then you could be on it. They could see you being authentic and vulnerable, and then reaching out a hand to lift you up or hold you up. Your statement is simply the first step. It's like the beginnings to your personal business plan. And then also connect. I would love to stay connected via LinkedIn. Email me a statement or your statement draft. I'm more than happy to continue working with you on that. It's certainly the first step in a much larger process. I do want to leave time for Q&A. And in conclusion, really in wrapping up the conversation today, I do offer, as part of First Edition Coaching, which is my coaching business, a free 30-minute coaching consultation for anyone who may be interested in exploring either building a first-time brand or reimagining, perhaps for an encore profession, reimagining their authentic personal brand. And it does come with a discount for UCLA alumni, again, on individual coaching or group workshops. So if you did not have an opportunity prior to scan my QR and you would like to do so now, I would love that. And with that, Joseph, if there were any questions that anyone had.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alicia. We had a few come in. And before we move to those, I did have a question for myself. The exercise was great that you went through. I think that is a very powerful tool. We actually did that last week in our staff or like a team meeting. And so it's really funny that you were sharing that in this webinar. But aside from that reflection, what would you say, just from your experience, are some immediate maybe resources that you can suggest for someone who's really wanting to like dive deeper in uncovering and establishing their authentic personal brand?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think because it starts with values and really identifying and defining, when we talk about authentic, right? Like identifying and defining the value set behind it. And for me, that starts with understanding what each of those values, what it means, what it really means. Like altruism is a great example. I had to go back and reread the definition of altruism several times to make sure if I was witnessing somebody else behaving in a particular way, I would know for a fact right away, gosh, that's altruism. I know that value, right? Like that's what that is. And that's what that looks like in practice. I think that's the first step. As far as resources, there are great books out there. Gosh, I would love to publish another one, right? Like the little book of very big values, and really just define these for people. When you think you have your finger on one or two, read more about it. Read more about it before you do anything else, before you start putting it or stepping out off that curb, so to speak, and putting into practice for yourself. Because if it's not the right one, people won't feel it. They won't necessarily catch you. But when you're on it, they'll feel it.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Thank you for answering my question. But to move on to the Q&A, we had one early on. The question is from an anonymous attendee, but it's for those who are currently in a career but are feeling burnt out, how do you suggest we can take some time to stop and reflect?
Yeah, burnout is obviously another big topic right now. And I'm always interested in delving even a little further into that, because there is a side of burnout right now that's being led by what a lot of the common literature is calling emotional labor. And if burnout is related to the actual job itself, if it's related to the tasks and perhaps the volume or, the actual subject or industry, that's one thing. But if the burnout is related to what we refer to as emotional labor, which is everything else, showing up to work and having to put on one particular emotional face, but actually feeling a different way, that's a completely different animal, right? And so I would always start with identifying, hey, am I feeling burnt out because of the industry, the tasks, and what's required of me from a job perspective itself? Or am I feeling burnt out because of all of this emotional weight and all of these, all of these other reasons, right? And I hope that makes enough sense, because emotional labor is a really big topic right now. But I think separating those and doing a lot of self-reflection to understand what is leading my sense of burnout is the first place to start. Because if it is industry, right, that's one pivot direction. But if it's the emotional labor associated with the work that we're doing, that's something else completely, and could very well be caused by what we are all feeling in the workplace right now.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think we just had a 3-part event last week on emotional labor at work. So you know what you're talking about when it comes to that. So thank you for answering that question. And to the person who asked it, I hope you got the answer that you were looking for. Moving on to the next question. How do you balance being authentic, which comes with an inherent degree of vulnerability, without putting yourself at risk of being too vulnerable?
Oh my gosh.
That's a great question.
Great question. It's a great question, right? Because, the way that I try to answer this question, right? Everybody's like level of tolerance, where they feel comfortable stepping into, right? I guess I'll use that curb analogy again. Some people are comfortable walking along a 12-inch curb. Other people want a 6-inch curb, right? They don't want to fall 12 inches or whatever the case may be. I would say the way you gauge what is comfortable for you, you have to start to step out there just a little bit. My personal measure, and certainly when I'm working with people, I keep in my mind the mindset of just create the space. Just create the space and allow people to come toward it, to have the conversation with the expectation that no one needs to reveal or share or be vulnerable. Just hold the space. And if someone comes into the space, so for example, if I was new to exercising vulnerability, I would choose someone to listen to me, like one-on-one, not in a group, but one-on-one, where I put something out there that might be a little bit more vulnerable and feel more authentic. And I would wait to see how it was received. And this is why choosing the right person to test the waters with this way professionally is wildly important. And then as you start to feel again, right, like that feeling of support, or this person held me while I was having this conversation, and then that circle starts to get a little wider. It starts to get wider. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there is a point at which you could be too vulnerable, but I would start with picking one right person in the workplace and sharing, and sharing in a way that is vulnerable. So.
Thank you for answering that. We have another question from Vincent. Yes. And the question is, for someone who's had several careers, it seems the job market is looking for congruence or consistent paths. An inconsistent path can seem inauthentic to some because there's a varied career path. Yes. Any advice on how to bridge that gap?
My advice, I'm sorry, go ahead, say.
Him being vulnerable.
Oh, well, my initial thought was find connection within all the incongruencies. So, the career path may seem inconsistent, but there is a common thread, right? There's a common thread among all of those. Find what it is and tell that story. Tell that story. And storytelling, we didn't talk about this, but storytelling is a huge component of building an authentic brand, right? My story failed again. I'm a Fortune 500. I've got this side hustle business. I am a volunteer for a trauma research center because I was sexually assaulted. Like all of these things, there's a common thread that weaves through all of them, right? And that's about building connection. And so, Vincent, I would say, think really hard about the common thread that weaves together those incongruent opportunities and tell that story.
Great, thank you. We have another question. I think it's along the same lines, but I think it's more of on a marketing perspective. Yeah. How do you reflect your authentic brand on your personal homepage? So yeah. I'm assuming maybe like their own personal website or maybe a LinkedIn, something like that.
Yeah, it's another great question. I see Becca sent this one in. It's another great question. I can tell you it's built, right? It's almost layered. And so it's built over time. UCLA hosted a great LinkedIn webinar last month, and I'm thinking about the gentleman who hosted it right now. It is not the short game, right? Social media is the long game. And so you were building it over time. I think I have built it through hashtagging, hashtag core values, hashtag authentic personal branding, and highlighting stories or leaders who've done things that support that idea, right? And that value. Word choice, for example, and creating connection via word choice and storytelling. Everyone that I work with knows that my thing is, hey, making sure that our messaging, that we have the right word, that we've chosen the right word that's going to create connection, so that people feel, right, seen, heard, and valued. And so do the same thing, even on your social media, but it's not like we can't overhaul it today and it's suddenly going to tell a story. Stories are built, right? One sentence at a time. You just have to build them.
Great, thank you for that. That was our last question. Any last or final thoughts before we close up today's webinar?
I so enjoy this. Thank you to the UCLA Alumni Association. Thank you to the participants. I look forward to hearing from all of you, and I look forward to you all going on the journey of discovering your own core values and building your own authentic personal brand. So thank you.
Thank you, Alicia, and join me in thanking her as well to everyone who's attending. Before we close, I did want to throw in the chat a link to our upcoming Career Coaches webinar sessions. The next one taking place on April 13th, Staking Your Claim, How Boundaries Can Set You Free in Work and Life. And then also, once the webinar ends, you will receive a follow-up survey. So please be sure to respond. Your responses and feedback will help us to improve our future programs. So with that, thank you again, Alicia. Thank you everyone for joining, and go Bruins.
Go Bruins.